The slap echoed in the manicured silence of the suburban street. It was a sharp, ugly sound that cut through the afternoon haze, followed by the thud of a textbook hitting the pristine lawn. Sarah stumbled backward, her hand flying to her cheek, where a red welt was already forming. Chad Sterling stood over her, his face a mask of casual cruelty, his polo shirt bright against the green grass. "Did you think I was joking?" he sneered, his voice dripping with the arrogance of someone who had never been told no. A low growl rumbled from beside Sarah. Max, her German shepherd, moved between them. His posture was rigid, his ears flat against his skull. The fur along his spine bristled. He was not a pet. He was a guardian, a silent partner in her grief since her father's death. Chad laughed, a short, barking sound. "You going to have your stupid dog fight your battles for you?" He took a step forward. Max did not bark. He did not hesitate. He lunged, a blur of black and tan muscle aimed at the threat to his girl. But Chad was ready. He pivoted, his expensive leather loafer swinging in a vicious arc. The kick connected with Max's ribs with a sickening crack. The dog yelped, a sound of pure pain, and collapsed onto the grass, whimpering as he struggled to breathe. Sarah screamed, dropping to her knees beside her fallen friend. "Max!" Chad adjusted his collar, looking down at the scene with utter disinterest. That's what happens when you don't listen. He turned and walked back toward his gleaming sports car parked at the curb, leaving Sarah sobbing over the injured animal. Bystanders on the street looked, then quickly looked away, their silence a form of consent. A block away, John Stryker sat in his truck, the engine off. He was just passing through, a ghost on his way to nowhere. The town was a waypoint, a place to refuel before continuing his long, aimless drive away from a past filled with sand, sweat, and the ghosts of fallen brothers. His hands rested on the steering wheel, scarred knuckles white. He had seen the whole thing, the casual violence, the deliberate cruelty, the cowardly silence of the onlookers. He had spent a decade of his life fighting monsters in faraway lands. He had promised himself he was done. That part of him was buried with his teammates, buried with Mike, Sarah's father. He was just a man with a truck and a dog of his own sleeping in the back, another retired warrior named Ares. But watching that boy kick that dog, watching that girl cry over her protector, something cold and dormant inside him began to stir. It was the feeling he got right before a breach, the calm, clear certainty of what had to be done. He opened the truck door. The click of the latch was unnaturally loud in the quiet street. John crossed the distance in long, measured strides. He did not run. He did not shout. His presence was a weight that settled over the scene. Chad was about to open his car door when he noticed the tall, broad-shouldered figure approaching. He straightened up, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "Can I help you?" Chad asked, his tone impatient. John's eyes were flat, chips of ice. He didn't look at Chad. He looked past him, at Sarah, who was trying to help the still whimpering Max. "Is he yours?" John's voice was low, a gravelly rumble. "The dog? No, the girl. She's a charity case," Chad said with a smirk. John's gaze finally settled on him. It was a look that had made hardened men drop their weapons. It was a look that carried the weight of firefights and lost friends. Chad's smirk faltered. "You're going to call an ambulance for the dog," John said. It was not a request. Chad scoffed, trying to reclaim his bravado. "I'm not calling anyone. Get out of my face." John took one more step, closing the distance until he was inches from Chad's face. He still hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. You hit a girl. You kicked a dog. Now you think you're going to walk away. Fear, a new and unfamiliar emotion, crept into Chad's eyes. He saw something in this man's stillness that was more terrifying than any shouted threat. My father is Richard Sterling. You have no idea who you're messing with. I know exactly what I'm messing with, John said quietly. He reached out, his hand moving not with speed, but with an unnerving deliberateness. He took Chad's phone from his hand. With his other hand, he grabbed Chad by the collar of his expensive shirt, his knuckles pressing into the boy's throat. Chad gasped, his feet shuffling on the pavement. John held the phone up. Veterinary hospital, now. His voice was a razor's edge. Trembling, Chad unlocked the phone and found the number. John took the phone back, pressed call, and put it on speaker. He then knelt beside Sarah, his movements fluid and efficient. My name is John. I was a friend of your father's, he said gently, his eyes scanning Max's injuries. We're going to get him help. Sarah looked up, tears streaming down her face, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. She recognized his name. It was a name her father had spoken with reverence. The vet's office answered. John gave them the address, his voice calm and precise. We have an injured German shepherd. Possible broken ribs. Probable internal bleeding. Victim of a blunt force trauma. We're 5 minutes out. He ended the call and looked at Sarah. He saw her father in her eyes, in the stubborn set of her jaw beneath the terror. He saw an innocence that the world was trying to crush. This ends today, he said to her, his voice softer than she would have thought possible. I promise you. It was a promise he had made before, on dusty rooftops and in the bellies of helicopters. It was a promise that had cost him everything, and he was making it again. He stood up, turning back to Chad, who was still pale and shaken. John handed him back his phone. You'll pay the bill. All of it. Then, with a gentleness that surprised even himself, he scooped the large dog into his arms. Max whimpered, but relaxed into his hold, sensing a protector. John carried him to his truck as if he weighed nothing. Get in, he said to Sarah. She scrambled to her feet and followed without a word, climbing into the passenger seat. As John pulled away from the curb, he saw Chad Sterling still standing there, watching them go, a look of impotent fury on his face. In his rearview mirror, John saw him finally get into his car and speed away in the opposite direction. The fight had just begun. He knew it. But this time, he wasn't fighting for a flag or a mission order. He was fighting for a promise. That evening, John sat in the sterile waiting room of the veterinary hospital. Max was in surgery. 2 broken ribs and a lacerated spleen. He would survive. Sarah sat beside him, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, silent. She hadn't spoken much, but her eyes rarely left his face. She was clinging to his presence like a drowning person to a raft. John's phone buzzed. An unknown number. He answered. Is this the man who accosted my son today? The voice was smooth, cultured, and layered with undisguised menace. Is this Richard Sterling? John countered, his own voice flat. It is. I understand you've involved yourself in a private family matter. A word of advice. Let it go. My son is young. He makes mistakes. I have already made a generous donation to the animal hospital to cover the expenses. Consider the matter closed. John looked over at Sarah, at the fading red mark on her cheek. It's not closed. A sigh of exasperation on the other end of the line. Mr. Whoever you are, you seem to misunderstand the situation. I own half this town. The police chief is a personal friend. The school board answers to me. You are a transient, a nobody. Do you really want to start a war you cannot possibly win? There's a difference between a war and an extermination, John said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You think your money makes you untouchable. You're about to learn that some things can't be bought. There was a moment of shocked silence. You are making a grave mistake, Sterling said, his voice now cold as steel. You will regret this. The line went dead. John lowered the phone. He had their attention. Good. The first step in dismantling any enemy structure was to make them reveal themselves. Richard Sterling had just confirmed he was the foundation. The next morning, John took Sarah to the police station. Max was stable, but would be hospitalized for several days. Sarah, though terrified, agreed she had to make a report. She clutched a small folder containing photos of Max's injuries and the initial vet bill. They were met by a portly, bored-looking desk sergeant who seemed annoyed by their presence. John calmly and clearly explained the situation. The assault on Sarah, the brutal kicking of the dog. The sergeant sighed, typing slowly into his computer. Chad Sterling, you said. He stopped typing and looked up at them. Son of Richard Sterling. That's right, John said. The sergeant leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from boredom to dismissive caution. Look, kids get into scuffles. It's a teenage thing. I'm sure if you just talked to Mr. Sterling, you could work this out. He's a very reasonable man. My friend's daughter was assaulted, and her dog was nearly killed, John stated, his voice level. We are here to file a report. And we'll file it, the sergeant said, making a show of typing a few more words. But without any other witnesses willing to come forward, it's a he said, she said situation. And frankly, between a pillar of the community and you, it's a tough sell. They were dismissed. John knew the report would be buried before the ink was dry. Next, they went to the high school to speak with the principal. The man was all smiles and feigned concern until the name Chad Sterling was mentioned. His demeanor changed instantly. Chad is an exemplary student, the principal said, folding his hands on his desk. He can be boisterous, but he's a good boy. His father is our school's most generous benefactor. We're in the middle of a fundraising drive for a new science wing, which Mr. Sterling is personally financing. He assaulted another student on her front lawn, John said. An unfortunate disagreement, I'm sure, the principal replied smoothly. Sarah, I'd advise you to put this behind you. Making waves won't do you any favors. We wouldn't want any complications with your academic record. It was a threat, wrapped in the language of concern. The system wasn't just broken, it was owned. As they walked out of the school, John saw a black sedan parked across the street. It had been there when they arrived at the police station. It was there now. They were being watched. That night, the campaign of intimidation began in earnest. A rock crashed through Sarah's living room window. Wrapped around it was a note. Leave. Last warning. John was there within minutes. He had told Sarah to call him if anything happened. He boarded up the window, his movements economical and precise. He saw the fear in her eyes, a fear that was beginning to curdle into despair. He thinks this will scare us, John said, sweeping up the last of the glass. It won't. The next day, Sarah's social media was flooded with vicious rumors and doctored photos. She was labeled as unstable, a liar, an attention seeker. Her few friends stopped texting her. In the school hallways, students who once smiled at her now averted their eyes or whispered as she passed. Sterling was isolating her, turning her into a pariah. John, meanwhile, found the tires of his truck slashed. A dead bird was left on his windshield. It was amateurish, meant to provoke and harass. He changed the tires without a word, his expression unreadable. Sterling was using thugs, disposable assets. It was a classic tactic of the powerful and lazy. The surveillance continued. The black sedan was a constant, lurking presence. John made a point of staring directly at it whenever he saw it. A silent acknowledgement. Let them watch. Let them think they had him on the defensive. One afternoon, as John was walking his own dog, Ares, two large, thuggish men blocked his path on the sidewalk. "You're a hard man to get a message to," the first one said, cracking his knuckles. "Mr. Sterling wants you to know your visit is over. It's time to leave town." "I'll leave when I'm finished," John replied, his body relaxed but ready. Ares, sensing the tension, stood at his side, a low growl in his chest. "I don't think you heard me," the man said, taking a step forward. The fight was short, brutal, and one-sided. John moved with a liquid efficiency that spoke of years of training. A blocked punch, an elbow to the throat, a knee to the solar plexus. The first man went down, gagging. The second hesitated for a fraction of a second, which was all John needed. A swift, disabling strike to his knee, and he crumpled to the ground, howling in pain. John looked down at them, his breathing even. "Tell Sterling he needs to hire professionals." He walked away, leaving them writhing on the sidewalk. He knew this was an escalation. Sterling had tried money, institutional power, and low-level harassment. Now he had tried direct physical intimidation. It had failed. The next step would be more severe. He had to move faster. That night, sitting in the quiet of his motel room, John Stryker decided the defensive phase was over. Sterling had built a fortress of wealth and influence around himself. John couldn't tear it down from the outside using a system that Sterling owned. He had to dismantle it from within. He needed his own network. He opened a hardened laptop and sent a single encrypted message. "Reaper, Doc, need a consult. Situation active." The reply came in under a minute. "On our way." He then made a second call. It was to a number he hadn't dialed in years, a name he had been given by a commanding officer long ago for a situation just like this. "Thorne." The voice was gruff. No nonsense. "This is John Stryker. I was given your name by Admiral Mason." There was a pause. "The Admiral. He's a good man. What do you need, Stryker?" "A pit bull. The system here is compromised. I have a victim, a clear-cut case of assault and intimidation, but the perpetrator is the son of a local tyrant. Police and school are in his pocket." "Pro bono?" Marcus Thorne asked. "If necessary," John said. "Good. The ones who can't pay are the ones who need me most. I'm a Marine, Stryker. We don't leave anyone behind. Send me everything you have. I'll start digging." The final piece was the public. Sterling controlled the local narrative. John needed someone who could break it open. He did some research, digging into local news archives. He found a name that kept reappearing in stories critical of Sterling's business practices. Amelia Vance. She was an investigative reporter for a small, independent online journal. A lone voice who had been trying to expose Sterling for years, only to be shut down by lawsuits and threats. He found her office in a small, cluttered room above a coffee shop. She was wary when he walked in, her eyes sharp and intelligent. "I'm not interested in another story about a disgruntled former employee of Sterling Industries," she said before he could even speak. "This isn't about his business," John said. It's about his son and a girl named Sarah. He laid out the story, from the assault to the slashed tires, the police stonewalling, the principal's veiled threats. He told her about the promise he'd made. Amelia listened, her expression shifting from skepticism to intense focus. When he was finished, she leaned forward. I've been getting whispers about Chad Sterling for years, stories of parties, of girls who were scared to speak up. But I never had a source willing to go on the record. Richard Sterling is an expert at silencing people. Sarah is willing, John said. But her voice alone isn't enough. You said there were others. There were, Amelia said, pulling out a locked file from a cabinet. Girls who transferred schools suddenly. Families that moved away overnight after a generous severance package from one of Sterling's companies. I have names, but they're scared, terrified. Fear is a cage, John said quietly. Sometimes, all people need is to see that the door isn't locked. A partnership was formed. Amelia would use her research to find the other victims. Marcus Thorne would handle the legal framework, preparing to shield them. And John, with his team, would provide the security and the strategy to make them feel safe enough to speak. 2 days later, a black van with no markings pulled into the motel parking lot. 2 men got out. One was built like a heavyweight boxer, with a calm, steady presence. That was Doc, their former corpsman. The other was wiry and moved with a restless energy, his eyes constantly scanning. Reaper, their communications and surveillance expert. They greeted John with firm handshakes and knowing looks. No questions asked about why. They just needed to know who and where. Richard Sterling and his son, Chad, John said, laying a map of the town on a table. They own the town. We're going to take it back. Reaper grinned. A good old-fashioned regime change. I've missed this. They got to work. Reaper swept John's truck and Sarah's house for listening devices, finding 3. He set up his own surveillance, discrete cameras covering the approaches to Sarah's home. He put a tracker on Chad Sterling's car. Doc, meanwhile, went with Sarah to visit Max at the vet, documenting his recovery and compiling a medical file that would be admissible in court. The next phase was recruiting the other victims. Amelia had a list of 3 other girls who had left school abruptly after encounters with Chad. John decided to approach the first one himself. Her name was Jessica. Her family now lived in a small, run-down apartment on the other side of the county. He found her father working as a mechanic, his hands stained with grease. When John mentioned the name Sterling, the man's face went pale. "We have nothing to say," he said, turning his back. "Your daughter was hurt," John said. "You took a payout to stay silent. Now another girl is being targeted. My friend's daughter. He died in Afghanistan serving this country. His daughter deserves justice. Your daughter deserves justice." The man stopped working, his shoulders slumping. "He promised he'd ruin us. He said he'd make sure I never worked in this state again. I had to protect my family." "The best way to protect your family is to make sure men like Sterling can't hurt anyone else," John said. "You won't be alone this time. We have a lawyer. We will protect you. I promise." He left his number. He didn't push. He had planted the seed. 2 days later, Jessica's father called. They would talk. The alliance was growing. The network of the righteous was forming, a quiet web being woven around Sterling's empire of fear. But Sterling was not a man to sit idle. He felt the shift in pressure, the subtle change in the battlefield, and he decided to escalate in a way that would end it, once and for all. The call came late at night. It was Sarah, her voice a choked whisper. "John, he's here." John was in his truck and moving before she finished the sentence. Reaper was already feeding him intel through his earpiece. No sign of forced entry. But Chad's car is parked 2 blocks away. He went in the back. John arrived at the house to find the back door splintered, hanging off its hinges. The house was dark and silent. A terrible, heavy silence. He drew the pistol he was licensed to carry, the cold metal a familiar weight in his hand. He moved through the house using the skills that had been drilled into him for a decade. Room by room. Quiet. Methodical. He found them in the living room. Sarah was on the floor, unconscious. Her face was bruised and swollen, a cut bleeding above her eye. Chad Sterling was standing over her, his knuckles bloody. He was breathing heavily, a wild, crazed look in his eyes. He had a small velvet box in his hand. "She just wouldn't listen," Chad said, his voice unnervingly calm. "I told her to stop. I told her this would all go away. But she kept talking to you." John didn't say a word. The world narrowed to a single point of focus. The rage inside him was not hot. It was glacial, a cold, silent, all-consuming fury that sharpened his senses and slowed time. He saw the girl on the floor, the promise he had made to her father, the arrogance of the boy who believed he was entitled to destroy lives. "You're done," John said. The 2 words hung in the air like a death sentence. Chad lunged, not at John, but toward the broken door. He was trying to flee. John moved to intercept, but Chad was faster than he looked. He shoved a table into John's path and scrambled out into the night. John didn't pursue. He holstered his weapon and immediately knelt beside Sarah. He checked her pulse, her breathing. She was alive. He called Doc on his comms. "I need you at Sarah's house, now. Full medical." As he gently examined her injuries, he saw something clutched in her right hand. He carefully pried her fingers open. It was a small gold cufflink, emblazoned with the initials RS. Not Chad's. Richard Sterling's. In the struggle, she had torn it from Chad's shirt, a shirt his father had likely given him. And under her fingernails, John saw it. Skin and blood. Chad's DNA. She had fought back. Even as she was being beaten, she had fought back. She had secured the evidence. When Doc arrived and took over her care, stabilizing her for the ambulance, John stood up and walked outside. He looked up at the dark sky, the cold night air doing nothing to quell the Arctic fire in his chest. He called Marcus Thorne. He put her in the hospital. "John, we can use this," Marcus said, his voice tight with anger. "The DNA evidence, the cufflink, this is it." "No," John said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "The by-the-book approach is over. He tried to kill the daughter of a SEAL. He crossed a line from which there is no retreat." He ended the call and opened his comms to Reaper. "I want everything you have. Every piece of dirt on Richard Sterling. Financial records, phone logs, secret accounts, everything. Burn your sources if you have to. I want him dismantled. I want his empire turned to ash." "Consider it done." Reaper's voice came back, grim and determined. John went to the hospital and sat in the waiting room while Sarah was treated for a severe concussion, a broken arm, and multiple contusions. He watched the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, each sound a testament to her survival, each one a nail in Sterling's coffin. He made one more call, to a number he had not used since his retirement. It was to an old contact inside the district attorney's office in the state capital, a man who owed him a favor, a big one. "Miller," John said when he answered. "I'm cashing in my chit." For the next 48 hours, John and his team worked without sleep. Reaper, fueled by caffeine and a cold fury of his own, tore through firewalls and back doors he had placed years ago. He emerged with a treasure trove of evidence: encrypted ledgers detailing bribes to city officials, recordings of phone calls where Sterling threatened business rivals, a hidden offshore account used to pay off the families of his son's previous victims. It was all there. The entire corrupt enterprise, laid bare in digital code. Marcus Thorne worked with Amelia Vance and the other victims, taking sworn, videotaped depositions. Jessica's story, now told without fear, was harrowing. The other two girls, bolstered by her courage, told their own. A clear, undeniable pattern of predatory behavior by Chad, and a criminal conspiracy to cover it up by his father. The centerpiece of their plan was a charity gala that Richard Sterling was hosting. It was the biggest social event of the year, a self-congratulatory affair where Sterling would present a massive check to the city council for a new development project. The mayor, the police chief, and the school principal would all be there, sharing the stage with him. John's contact, Detective Miller from the state capitol, had assembled a small, trusted team of incorruptible officers. They were on standby, waiting for the signal. The night of the gala, the ballroom was filled with the city's elite, all dressed in their finest, sipping champagne and applauding Richard Sterling's generosity. He stood at the podium, basking in the spotlight, the very picture of civic virtue. "It is in giving that we receive," Sterling said, his voice smooth and practiced. "And this city has given me so much. I am merely giving back." As he spoke, the two large screens on either side of the stage, which had been displaying the gala's logo, flickered and changed. Reaper had gained control. Suddenly, the screen was filled with an image of Chad Sterling's bloody knuckles, then a picture of Sarah, lying unconscious on her living room floor. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Then, the audio began. It was a recording Reaper had captured from a bug planted in Sterling's office. It was Richard Sterling on the phone with the police chief the morning after the assault on Sarah. "Make it go away, Frank," Sterling's voice boomed through the ballroom. "Bury the report. I don't care what you have to do. My son was never there. Is that clear?" "Crystal, Richard," the police chief's voice replied. "Consider it done." The police chief, standing on the stage, went white as a sheet. Panic erupted in the room. Richard Sterling stared at the screens, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. "Turn it off!" he roared. "Turn that off now!" But it was too late. The next piece of evidence appeared: the sworn, videotaped testimony of Jessica. Her tearful, powerful account of what Chad had done to her, and how her family had been paid for their silence, silenced the room. Then the next victim's testimony played, and the next. The final piece of evidence was a bank statement from Sterling's offshore account, showing a direct payment to the police chief's wife, labeled consulting fee. The doors to the ballroom burst open. Detective Miller and his team of state officers strode in, their faces grim. They ignored the panicked crowd and walked directly to the stage. As they approached, a figure emerged from the side of the stage. It was Sarah. Her arm was in a sling, a bandage on her forehead, but her head was held high. She walked to the podium, her eyes locking with Richard Sterling's. John and Doc stood discreetly at the back of the room, watching. "You thought you could buy my silence." Sarah's voice, though quiet, was steady and clear, amplified by the microphone. "You thought you could beat me into submission. You thought you were untouchable." She looked out at the silent, horrified crowd. "You were wrong. I am not scared of you anymore." Detective Miller stepped up beside her. He turned to Richard Sterling. "Richard Sterling, You are under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, and obstruction of justice. He then turned to the pale-faced police chief. Frank Miller, you are under arrest for accepting a bribe and obstruction of justice. As handcuffs were snapped onto their wrists, another team of officers intercepted Chad as he tried to flee through a service exit. Chad Sterling, an officer said, blocking his path. You're under arrest for aggravated assault. The untouchable tyrant and his vicious son were led away in front of the very people whose admiration they had so desperately cultivated. The fortress had crumbled from within. Justice, swift and absolute, had arrived. The trial was a formality. The evidence was overwhelming. Reaper's digital trail, the victim's testimony, the DNA from under Sarah's fingernails. It was an avalanche that buried the Sterling legacy forever. Richard Sterling and his son both received lengthy prison sentences. The corrupt police chief, the school principal, and a half-dozen city officials implicated in the bribery scandal were all convicted and removed from their positions. The town was cleansed. A few weeks after the verdict, John was at the local park, throwing a ball for Aries. Max, now fully recovered, was there too, running and playing, his movements joyful and free. Sarah sat on a bench nearby, sketching in a notebook, a small smile on her face. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a quiet strength. A car pulled up, and Marcus Thorne got out. He walked over to John. "Thought you'd want to see this," he said, handing John a letter. It was from Jessica's father. It was a simple, heartfelt thank you. He had a new job in a new town, and his daughter was in therapy, healing. "We did a good thing here, John," Marcus said. "We did," John agreed, watching Sarah laugh as Max stole the ball from Aries. Later that week, another visitor came. It was the wife of the disgraced police chief. She found John at the small house he had decided to rent on the edge of town. She stood on his porch, looking small and ashamed. "I came to apologize," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I knew the money was dirty. I knew what my husband was doing, what the Sterlings were doing. But I was a coward. I enjoyed the lifestyle. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For my part in it." John simply nodded. Her apology couldn't undo the harm, but it was a crack of light in the darkness of her own making. It was a start. With the storm past, John found himself with a familiar problem, a mission completed, but no new orders. The aimless drive no longer called to him. The ghosts of his past felt more distant. He had honored his promise to Mike. He had protected his daughter. One afternoon, he took Sarah and Max to visit her father's grave. It was a simple headstone in a quiet cemetery. "He would have been so proud of you," John said, standing beside her. "He would have been proud of you too," she replied, leaning her head against his arm for a moment. "Thank you, John, for everything." On the drive back, an idea began to form in John's mind. He had seen the powerful bond between Sarah and Max. He knew the healing power of a loyal dog. He knew how many veterans came home broken, feeling as lost as he had. He spent the next few months converting the old barn on his rented property. With help from Reaper and Doc, who decided to stick around, he founded a non-profit. Its mission was simple: to rescue shelter dogs, train them as service animals, and pair them with veterans suffering from trauma. He named it the Maximus Project. His new purpose was not about fighting monsters anymore. It was about healing heroes. It was about taking the skills he had learned in war, discipline, patience, an understanding of the wounded psyche, and using them to build instead of destroy. The story ends not with a bang, but with a quiet evening. John sat on his porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Sarah was there, reading a book, her college acceptance letter sitting on the table beside her. Aries and Max lay at their feet, two faithful guardians at peace. John looked at the quiet scene, at the life they had reclaimed from the ashes of Sterling's greed. He had come to this town a ghost, haunted by the past. But in fighting for an innocent, in keeping a promise, he had found his own way back. He had found his peace. The war was over. He was finally home.